Okay, well, for more analysis on this extraordinary meeting, let's bring in Lwazi Somya, who's an international relations analyst joining us from Johannesburg. So, warm welcome. So, it started off all very friendly. It was quite complimentary between the two leaders. You know, they were really sort of gushing over each other at one point. But then it descended into this he said, she said business. What did you make of it all?
Well, this was expected because there were two frames of mind that the South African negotiators went in there. One, this could turn into a Zelensky situation, or it could turn into a Marconi situation with the Prime Minister of Canada. And in this situation, it was an in-between. However, when you assess the objectives of the meeting, number one, to reset the bilateral relationship between South Africa and the United States, and number two, to begin the process to negotiate a trade and investment deal between the United States and South Africa. And number three, to push back against misinformation around the white genocide, and especially considering around the Expropriation Act. I think President Cyril Ramaphosa has achieved all three of those objectives of the meeting, even though it came at the expense of some drama coming from the White House.
Do you think that he did when you mentioned the misinformation there? Because Trump seemed pretty convinced in what he was saying, especially when he was showing that footage. He didn't seem to be changing his mind at all.
So when you look at Donald Trump, especially after the comments from his friends from the golfing community, you had Rediff Hussain, Ernie Els, and South African billionaire Johan Rupert. President Trump seems to calm down in his rhetoric. There are reports following the meeting that after this sit-down session, there was a lovely lunch where the conversation was much more cordial than it was in front of the media. And therefore, President Cyril Ramaphosa and President Trump authorizing both of the officials to begin the trade negotiations also signaled that there was not a complete breakdown in the relationship, and both our governments believing that this can be resolved.
And how much do you think was learned from the Volodymyr Zelensky meeting that was obviously very combative with Trump? Do you think maybe lessons were learned from that and they were already prepared? And also he did mention Nelson Mandela as well, the way that he would handle such a situation.
South Africa prides itself in its ability to mediate in situations where it's a very hostile environment. President Cyril Ramaphosa was one of the chief negotiators for South Africa's democracy, having to negotiate with the apartheid government. So he has a lot of experience engaging with very hostile environments like these. And therefore, he implemented his diplomatic tool set in order for him to lower down the hostility between the United States and South Africa. That he did well. However, what is now manifesting is that whether or not South Africa can convince a fringe white supremacist grouping that exists both within South Africa and in the United States, whether or not there's a genocide, is another issue altogether. However, there seems to be consensus throughout the international community that there is no genocide within South Africa. And empirically, when you look at the murder statistics of South Africa alone, around 27,000 murders happened in the previous financial year within South Africa, which is relatively high. However, out of those 27,000 people, less than 1% were white people. And by definition of genocide, this situation can be explained and talked through with President Trump. However, I'm not quite certain whether President Trump is willing to back down on these allegations on the basis that they serve his domestic constituents and also a foreign right-wing government and also following internationally.
All right, we really appreciate that, Mrs. Somya. Thank you very much indeed. An international relations analyst joining us live from Johannesburg.